Bam, ba, bam, bam, ba, bam, 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 ba, bam, bam, ba, bam, bam. Do da dee dee da da da. Welcome to Rainbows Are Circles, a podcast exploring human potential and everyday wonder. What possibilities open up for us when we explore life with optimism, curiosity, and an open mind? Join me, Julie Malari, as we wake up to wonder and speak with inspirational guests on the topics of personal development, alternative health, and even magical, mystical, yet often misunderstood practices. Are you ready? Do 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 do. Ba be dee bee ba dee bee. Wow 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 wow. Astrology is the study of the relationship between the planetary bodies and human affairs. This is a topic that many people feel skeptical about, especially if your only experience with astrology is the generalized information in a newspaper horoscope. We may wonder, how can a planet that is so far away in space possibly have an effect on me? It seems a bit far-fetched until we consider the powerful effect that the moon has on our ocean tides. If the moon can make Earth's huge bodies of water rise and fall, what effect might it have on us human beings, who are made of 60% water? In this fascinating episode, we speak with second-generation evolutionary astrologer Eileen Mello to shed light on this often misunderstood topic. She explains astrology as the language of the planets, cosmic knowledge that we are given to assist us on our human paths. We will explore what is astrology and what are the planetary archetypes. How can astrology help us to understand ourselves better and lead to greater self-acceptance? Do the planets really exude energies that provide guidance to us here on Earth? And if so, how can we align with these cosmic energies so that we're working with them to our best advantage? Explore all of this and more as we wake up to wonder with Eileen Mello. I'd like to start just by hearing a little bit about yourself and how you became interested in this topic.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. Good morning to you. I'm really excited to share with you. I started studying astrology as a young girl, and I wouldn't say that I was formally studying. Rather, I was immersed in the language and the culture of astrology because my mother started studying when I was 10. And that included a very formal study. She was studying with some of the most renowned astrologers at the time, and also later attended Kepler College, which is an astrological college based out of Washington in Seattle. And so I was very, what is the word? I said immersed before. That's the best word. I was immersed in this language with my mother, who I'm very close to, single mom raising me alone. And it was just the underpinning and the foundation of my life for many, many years. And then around the age of 30, I began formally studying with my mother. And today I've been consulting professionally for the last 2 years. And what I love most about astrology is that it absolutely is what I consider to be a rabbit hole, meaning there's no end to the study. There's so much to learn and new techniques constantly to learn that it feels as though there's something interesting and magical at every turn. The more you learn, the more you want to study. And so it's been very fun in that way for me. I have a very curious mind, and so I enjoy the process of just learning, and constantly adapting and honing my skill in that way.
Can you define astrology for us?
Sure. I'm glad that you asked. That's really important. My definition of astrology is there is a fundamental correspondence between the planets and human behavior. And I like to use the word archetype. So the planets have archetypal energy that empirically, if you were to take the time to observe, as astrologers have been doing for a millennium, that the archetypes of the planets coincide with what is happening on Earth, both collectively and also in our individual lives. So archetype, the definition of an archetype, this is a rather tricky word. There's a lot of different definitions based on the discipline that you're studying. So a lot of folks know that there's definitely a psychological definition to archetype based on Freud and Jung's work. Also, Plato talked a lot about archetypes. I like to use Richard Tarnas's definition. Richard Tarnas is a historian, and he's also an acclaimed astrologer. He is a PhD professor in San Francisco, and he's also a psychologist. So he defines archetype as a universal principle or force that affects the human psyche and human behavior. And so that can be either a transcendent mythic quality like we find in the Greek and Roman myths, or it can be a really specific psychological expression like Freud and Jung talked about. But we're all familiar with archetypes in our daily lives. It's what we experience when we go to the movies constantly, right? We have the hero archetype, the victim archetype, the prostitute archetype, the archetype of the mother or the father. The list just goes on indefinitely. And so it's these qualities or archetypes that we've ascribed, that astrologers have ascribed to the various planets based on methodical observation, empirical data that we see over time corresponding with human affairs, especially an individual's natal chart or horoscope in astrology. So we can see that specific planets, individual planets, actually bear a very close archetypal reference to an individual's natal chart, and that's how we interpret the natal charts. I know that's complex, so if that doesn't make sense, please tell me.
No, it does make sense, and I'm just wondering, how did they, so I know that this is a science that evolved because people were observing, I guess, the movement of planets and stars and how these things would affect them personally. I'm just wondering, like, how they came up with the archetypes associated with the planets.
Oh, right. That's a great question. And so ancient astrologers who obviously the night sky looked dramatically different thousands of years ago than it does now, just by virtue of light pollution. So they could see a lot more. And in ancient times, we as humans ascribed a mythical, transcendent meaning to these events, right? So the gods were responsible for what was happening on our planet. It wasn't, now we have much different languaging that we use, and we're in the age of reason. And so today we explain these things with logical, more scientific. Even folks in the spiritual community will say, well, I manifested this, or what's on the outside reflects what's on the inside, right? We have a much different languaging for these things. But again, when I talk about empirical data is simply by observation. So the planets are ascribed characteristics and archetypes based on what ancient astrologers actually observed was transpiring when the planets were in certain formations. So it's the planets dictating what we ascribe to them, not vice versa. And in ancient times, actually, I don't know when the word ancient comes in. How far back do you have to go to be ancient? But I know in early science with, I shouldn't even say early, but more like medieval, when we had the scientists Galileo and Kepler and Newton, a lot of these gentlemen were also astrologers. The medical and the astrology went hand in hand. And this is why, because to understand what was happening with an individual, you also had to have a basic understanding of what was happening with their astrology, because the astrology was a roadmap to what was happening for the individual. So you wouldn't treat one person the way you would treat another person medically, because they have different horoscopes, and you would be looking at what transits were happening with the planets, meaning where were the planet's movement in the existing sky in correspondence to their birth chart, their horoscope. And so therefore, how would I treat that person based on the existing transits? Because again, of these archetypal energies and the patterns of energy that are playing out in real time.
So is it all based on sort of what the stars and the planets were doing at the time of your birth? Is that how?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So, and individuals, there's all these different words. They're basically synonyms, but a lot of people use the word chart, my chart. So it's your natal chart, your horoscope. Any of these three words will suffice, but I like to use the word chart. So your natal chart at the time of your birth is essentially a map of the heavens. And that's primarily the planets. Some astrologers will include asteroids and stars occasionally. But when you're talking about astrology, you're really talking about the sun, the moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Saturn, Jupiter, Pluto, and Uranus. So those are the big planetary energies that we're looking at. Obviously, the sun and moon aren't planets, but they are directly affecting us humans on planet Earth. And so we consider them planets, just that's how the Greeks considered them. And so we just use that word, even though we know scientifically they're not.
Okay. And that's because these are like the largest
they're the planetary bodies in our solar system that we can see and directly observe. And obviously, like Uranus, for example, I think was discovered in the late 18th century. And so that wasn't a planet that the ancients were observing and studying. And so there is in the astrological community a lot of discussion about the newly discovered planets, Uranus and Pluto, and their effects on us, because we simply don't have the same empirical data that we do with Venus, Mars, and even Jupiter and Saturn, right? We haven't been observing them for quite as long, and not nearly as long, actually. And so we're still discovering how the outer planets, we call them the outer planets because they're further away, are affecting us. But we can see there have been, like going back to Richard Tarnas, who I mentioned earlier, he has a large body of work on Uranus as a historian. And so even though we haven't been observing them for as long a period of time, what we do have is historical records. And so we can go back and say, what was Uranus, for example, doing in the 2nd century, right? We can go back to the 2nd century and see and observe if the archetypes that we have ascribed to Uranus are actually accurate based on history. That helps us hone in and what's the word? Really observe accurately.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about what the different archetypes are associated with the different planets?
I can give you some really great examples. And so when we're talking about what we call the inner planets in astrology, the personal planets, that is Mercury, Venus, Mars, and to some extent Jupiter. And excuse me. So we look to the Greek mythology for those archetypes. And Mercury, for example, is the messenger god. He is the god who is allowed free reign throughout all the realms, meaning he can go from heaven into hell, back to earth, and he's able, in the mythology, he has Zeus's permission to freely traverse all of the realms. He's the only god who's able to do this, whereas most of the gods have to have permission to go in and out of Hades, hell. And usually in the mythology, once you go to hell, you don't ever come out. It's a very risky endeavor. And so this is important because Mercury doesn't have to ask permission because he's delivering messages and communicating with everybody. So Mercury has this, he has free reign, so to speak, over movement and the communication. He knows everybody. He's communicating with everybody. He's basically friends with everybody. Everybody looks forward to seeing him because he's delivering some bit of information or news. So when we look at the astrology, when you're looking at a person's horoscope, when you see the planet Mercury, you ascribe these characteristics, these archetypes of communication, and also friendliness, and interacting with large groups of people, different people, having the ability to communicate with all different types of people. It's also our mental processes. So in the astrology, you would look to the planet Mercury to see how you're perceiving your environment around you, and most importantly, language, and not just communication of written, spoken communication, but also how we perceive what's happening around us, how we ingest that information, and then how we communicate it back. So, for example, we humans think primarily in emotions and symbols, right? When we have a thought, that thought is not in words. So if I were to say to you, I like to use this example, I'm going to grill asparagus for dinner. You see the image of asparagus or a barbecue or the grocery store, whatever it is, right? You see an actual image in your mind, and that image is then translated into words. So that's Mercury's function. And we can see that in the mythology that he is the communicator. So that's one example of how these archetypes play out.
Okay. And is that why when they say that Mercury is in retrograde, a lot of times communication gets kind of messed up?
That's exactly right. And it's funny because Mercury went retrograde today, and you had a computer problem this morning, right? We had this issue where you had to send me a new link for the Zoom to do the podcast. And I laughed because I thought, oh, how perfect of Mercury. And so when we talk about retrogrades, what a retrograde is, of course, the planets cannot move backward. That's not possible. But in the night sky, if you're observing the planets, it does appear to our vantage point as though the planet is moving backward. And that's what we call a retrograde.
And sorry, Eileen, it got kind of quiet it got a little bit quiet, your voice.
Yeah, I'll repeat. So retrograde astrologically is from the human vantage point on Earth. It's when a planet looks as though it's moving backward. Of course, the planets don't move backward. This is just how it appears to our eye. And so right now, Mercury is in retrograde motion to our eye. And that usually is a 3-week period of time. It happens 3 times a year. And all of the planets can go retrograde except the sun and the moon. We don't ever have that appearance, but or the appearance of them moving backward, right? This only applies to the planets. And in pop culture today, we have a lot of discussion about the Mercury retrograde, and everybody likes to talk about the technological snafus. And that is right, because Mercury is representative of communication. And so we do find that a lot of things tend to go wonky or bonkers. And I've personally observed that a lot of folks who have Priuses or other computerized vehicles tend to also have car problems now. And by the way, Mercury does also rule. We call it rule, what the rulership is for a planet. Mercury also rules transportation because he's moving constantly, right? So various modes of transportation are ascribed to Mercury. So that seems to be, I've observed that folks who have computers in their vehicles have car troubles during this time. But those issues are a very superficial interpretation of retrogrades. And I would like to remind our listeners that astrology really is an ancient wisdom, and it's in its most pure or fundamental form, it can be used to help us on our spiritual path. And if you look at a Mercury retrograde in terms of a more transcendent interpretation, it's a time for reevaluation. So my mother likes to say that the retrogrades are a time for all the rewords. So reevaluating, reemergence, anything that begins, you're redoing things. And this time can be spent with really looking at what's happening in our lives and assessing them, reassessing what's happening. And so, yes, we can find on a surface level that we're redoing things, and the computer gets slow or the link doesn't work or whatever it may be, more than is average. But at a deeper level, it's a time to really reflect and to reconsider what's taking place in our lives and whether or not we're in alignment.
Okay. Okay, I love that because I think that sometimes people can get really scared when Mercury is in retrograde.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, I shouldn't do this. I shouldn't travel. I should just, kind of, keep things as low key as possible. But it's not necessarily that we have to do that. It's probably helpful to know when Mercury is in retrograde. So if you can avoid travel during those times, would it be best to do that?
I don't think traveling under a Mercury retrograde is problematic. I think what is helpful for folks to realize is just that there might be delays and miscommunications. And so allowing for more time and also realizing that you have to be very clear. So instead of maybe sending a quick text message while you're waiting at the stoplight, you park your car and you actually call the person or the travel agent, right? And so you have more clarity in your communications, which prevents confusion. And that's really helpful during a Mercury retrograde. There is some wisdom to the idea of not signing contracts and other things, other major business deals during a Mercury retrograde for the same reason of the lack of clarity. There's often just basic miscommunications that are not at the fault of either party. It just seems to be that communications can be more unintentionally and unknowingly nebulous. And so often what we find is that we redo things that we began under Mercury retrograde, or we're just redoing things in general, like the computer crashes and now I have to write that letter again, or, oh, I wrote a 5-page paper under Mercury retrograde and I wrote it all with a faulty premise and now that's been clarified and I have to go back and rewrite my paper, right? So it doesn't mean you don't do any of the things that you normally would. It's just having that awareness that there are, and this goes back to more of that deeper understanding that things are coming to light that we maybe weren't aware of. And so then it causes you to reevaluate and to do things differently.
Okay. That's good to hear because that's a lot more empowering and proactive than just being scared and not wanting to do anything during you just have to be extra clear and just give yourself a little more time and know that things may happen. So, just try to be extra clear and proactive about
it. Right. Okay. And it's a really great reminder in our technological world because we are all moving so quickly all the time and our communications seem to be reduced further and further to the most impersonal forms that, I'm 38 years old and email came out when I was a teenager. We all started using email. And I remember a day when you actually would say, hey, Julie, how are you? What's going on? And then you launch into your message and then you're like, okay, I'll talk to you later. Bye, Eileen, right? Now we're sending each other texts where we don't even greet each other. It's just like, I'll be there at 10 or where did you say you wanted to meet? It's like we're talking at each other and not to each other. There seems to be less and less actual corresponding and more like talking into a void that seems to respond but isn't actually real communication. And of course, some would argue that email is not real communication if you're used to the phone or in person, right? Like, so our communication is evolving. These are all functions of Mercury. So how we're communicating and the quality of our communications, this is also all within Mercury's domain. So when things go awry, yes, we can probably look at the astrology personal or collectively and see how Mercury is playing a role in that.
Okay. I'm glad we talked about that because I always kind of wondered about that Mercury in retrograde thing.
Yeah, it's kind of taken over pop culture. I even had somebody I work with recently said, oh, it must be double Mercury retrograde. First of all, there's no such thing. And secondly, Mercury is not in retrograde. Right? So I just looked at her like, oh my God, this is what's happening in the world. Like, people really do not understand astrology, even though it seems to be, it's a funny phenomenon that the more the more accepted astrology is and the more we see it in our daily lives in terms of pop culture references, the more diluted it's becoming and actually the less understood. So astrologers have a little bit of educating to do, which is fine. I think it's great that more people have their pulse on astrology because it is an ancient wisdom that provides tremendous value in people's lives. And I think that there is a clear attraction to the value of astrology. People seem to inherently understand that astrology can be extremely useful to their lives, and that's why there's this kind of globbing onto it. But there also is this kind of a virulent strain of misinformation when it comes to astrology as well. Like, we're in this misinformation era, and that absolutely applies to astrology. So for folks who both are skeptical or very curious about it, the awareness that what you see outside in the everyday world in reference to astrology is really at best, it's usually highly diluted compared to if you're going to more traditional resources and teachers, et cetera, to learn astrology. You're going to get you're in store for something much different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm like, double Mercury retrograde would mean it's just going regular again.
It's funny that you say that because I said something similar to my mom the other day. I was like, and it was a joke, but it was like, I'm going to have to do this thing under Mercury retrograde, but I'm having this really bad aspect in my chart. So will they just kind of cancel each other out? Like, can I just cross my fingers and hope? And sadly, that's not the way it works. But.
My boyfriend and I were talking yesterday, and he mentioned, well, just to play kind of devil's advocate, when I read astrology charts, like, and he actually said, when I was a teenager and I used to read my sister's girly magazines and I would read the astrology charts, I realized that they all applied to me in some way. So, does this really work, or is it just really generic? And I was like, well, I think those charts are very general, and I think that they don't really do justice to what the science of astrology is. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So when you're reading a horoscope in a newspaper or magazine or other publication, it really is very generalized information. And so your boyfriend's point that he could find something true about each sign's interpretation or horoscope for that month to be accurate for him, that's absolutely true, actually, because we all have those signs in our natal chart. So our natal charts are divided into 12 houses, and each house is represented by one of the 12 zodiac signs. And so even though, for example, I'm a Capricorn and my moon is in the sign of Gemini, even though I would not read a horoscope for the sign of Cancer because that's not my sun sign. It's also not my moon sign. I do have the Cancer house in my chart, and there is something going on there usually, right? And so we can see how all of these energies, like, another way of saying this is a lot of people will say, oh, well, I don't have any water in my chart, like, right? Because of the different elements. We have 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. So they'll say, I don't have any water in my chart. Well, you might not have a lot of water in your chart, but you do have 3 houses in your chart that are water houses. And so we all have those elements in our chart. We all have those same signs in our chart. And we just have some of us have more of an emphasis of different energies in our charts, but generally, going back to the horoscopes that we're reading, these are super, super generalized. It is the most basic information that you can read about astrology. And so, yes, it's 100% true that sometimes those horoscopes are going to be right on in a way that's absolutely astounding. And then other times you're going to read it and go, what the hell are you talking about? This does not apply to me in any way whatsoever.
Do you recommend any books or resources?
So astrology is super complex and it really is very technical. And so there are quite a few excellent beginners books. One that I love that I read from front to back was Choice Centered Astrology, and the author is Gail Fairfield. And it's a wonderful introduction to astrology and all the most fundamental components, the building blocks of astrology. And there's also a workbook by a very famed astrologer, very well respected in the field. Her name is Demetra George. And that one is called Astrology for Yourself, I believe.
Okay. Okay. And what do you love about astrology?
Oh, everything.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that what I love most about it is that it is a helpful tool for navigating life. I find that life is often difficult and confusing, and astrology helps me better understand what is happening and to get a pulse on not just what is happening, but why, and how I can use what is transpiring in my life to deepen my spiritual practice and be more aligned with these mysterious cosmic forces that we really don't yet have any sort of scientific explanation for, and yet we see things happening all the time around us that we can't explain, and astrology explains those things. So that's very important to me. But also, and I hear this frequently, I ask a lot of my students, what is it about astrology that you find valuable? And time again, and people say this in almost the exact same language each time, and it's the exact phrase I have used dozens of times myself, and that is, astrology helps me understand myself better. And so that is by far the most helpful thing. It's just knowing who I am and deepening my understanding of how I navigate through life and why. Because we are, even though humans, fundamentally we're all the same, and yet there are so many different expressions of our humanity. And so we are all unique and different in these ways, right? Yeah, and then as I said before, and when we first started talking, it's just the most beautifully complex system that I've ever encountered, and there's no end to the learning. So for folks who get folks who have a lot of Gemini energy like me, who are very curious and get bored easily and master things quickly, the study of astrology is just endlessly fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you, can you tell us maybe a story or an example of how you've seen astrology benefit you or maybe one of your students?
Yeah, in fact, I'll tell a brief story about one of my teachers. His name's Maurice Fernandez. He's an evolutionary astrologer, and he's incredible. He's a very brilliant person. He's an excellent teacher. And he found astrology during a time, and this is a public story that he's told. I'm not disclosing any personal information that he wouldn't, hasn't disclosed himself. But essentially, he was suicidal from depression. And his life had become so difficult and I think meaningless in some ways. And he discovered astrology then, and he started studying, and it not only brought him back from depression, but it's now his life's path and his life's work. And he's gone on to be, as I said, a fabulous, brilliant teacher. But it was understanding that he was undergoing very specific transits that put pressure on him in these difficult ways, and that there was purpose in it, and that he could harness that energy it's like the alchemical process of taking something difficult and using it to improve upon yourself. And that really is one of the values of astrology, is having a client sitting in your office who's like, I don't understand why I'm going through this. Why am I had someone recently who said to me, why are all my relationships so difficult right now? And I was going to ask her if she was having difficulty in her relationships before she even said that to me, because I could see it in the chart. And this is where astrologers, all of our training assists the client, because we can see the ways in which the planets are in aspect, the transits that a person is having to their natal chart, and specific planets put tension on you in different ways. Sometimes they bring grace and ease, right? We see this in our lives. I say it's the wheel. Sometimes we're up, sometimes we're down, but that is the human condition. Sometimes life is easy and happy and joyous, and other times life is painful and difficult, and we're in a state of crisis, or we're observing other people in a state of crisis. And you can see this in the astrology, and inevitably the wheel goes up and it goes down. These are cycles of life, and they do not last forever. And so somebody like my teacher Maurice, who is going through a cycle of depression can feel as though it is a never ending drain on your energy, and that life will never change. And when you study astrology, you see actually that this is a 2-year transit, or this is momentary, whatever it may be. And this is also the purpose of it. So not only will it not last forever, but this is what these energies are here to do for my soul's evolution. Like, what is the actual spiritual purpose of this? How can, as I said before, how can I harness this energy and work with the energy rather than resist it and fight against it? Because inevitably, well, I shouldn't use the word inevitably, but I believe, this is a belief system, that the planets are, this will sound so cheesy, but I think the planets are our friends. I actually believe that astrology is the language of the planets, and that we are being given divine knowledge, or at least cosmic knowledge. And if we pay attention, and if we learn how to speak this language of the planets, that we are being assisted on a moment-to-moment basis with this knowledge to live a life that is more harmonious and in flow with whatever crazy cosmic order exists here. Because there is some sort of cosmic order, even if we have a difficult time understanding it or aligning to it. There definitely, we all wake up in the morning, there's gravity, the planets keep growing, right? There's something holding all of this together.
I actually really love that idea of planets being our buds.
Yeah.
And just the idea in general of being more connected to our world, our environment, our surroundings, the planets, the plants, the water, oceans. I think it can be really easy for people to think like, oh, I don't understand like how something so far away, like the
right.
planets or the moon, could affect me in this way. But I guess one really simple example could be just how the moon and the power of the moon affects our water and the tides. Would that be an example?
Absolutely. And that's an example I point to frequently. And it's not just that we can observe it with the oceans and other bodies of water, and we are mostly comprised of water. So if the moon is affecting the ocean, which is a vast quantity of water, it sure is affecting our tiny little human bodies, right? But you also see this from medical professionals. They'll tell you, anybody who works in an emergency room, we've all heard these stories about what happens on full moon nights. And if you travel around the world, you'll find that there's full moon ceremonies across the world. Each culture has their own version. Sometimes they're very deeply spiritual. Sometimes it's just a bunch of people getting together on a beach and doing a lot of drugs. But I mean, we all have this innate kind of desire to express ourselves in a different way under a full moon. It's this very potent energy. And yeah, I mean, the moon is a dead rock, right? It's a rock. So we can imagine then these enormous planets in our solar system. And unfortunately, this is why people are still skeptical about astrology, because we don't have the scientific explanations to demonstrate how these energies of the planets affect us on a day-to-day basis. We can only observe that indeed they do and suspend the rational mind's need to know why, right? When you can suspend that and just say, I'm observing this to be true. I don't know why it's true or how it's true, but it sure is, then there's just tremendous value from astrology.
Mm. It's really easy to dismiss things if there's not a lot of, I guess, Western science to support it. Mm-hmm. But I think this whole idea of your own experimentation, your own direct experience, like that is so powerful, and that can be way more powerful than, reading a scientific article or paper on
yeah, that's absolutely true. And my mom, so oftentimes I'll say to my mom, I'll ask her a question, because the wonderful thing about having an astrologer for a mother is that I can just call her up on the phone or pop over at her house and say, hey, Mom, explain this to me. And oftentimes she'll say, well, what's your experience? How are you experiencing this? Wait 5 more days or wait 2 more weeks and then tell me what you observed. Like it's how we experience. So that's something that's very important about astrology. A lot of people think that the planets are dictating what is happening to us. That is not true. And sometimes, because our language is limited, astrologers will speak about the planets that way, even though that's not actually the truth of the matter. It's like we're limited by our language and how we interpret. But the planets are exuding certain types of energies that affects us. How it affects us is unique to every single person, but it will fit within this paradigm of, maybe paradigm is not the right word, but this framework of archetypal energy. So for example, if you're talking about Mercury, you are going to find that the themes that are associated with Mercury will come into play in your life in some way, but it's going to affect each person differently. And so that's where the free will steps in. The planets do not dictate the course of your life. They are simply suggesting certain themes. So for example, this is, if you are having your Mercury transit, they're very short-lived because the planet is moving very, very quickly. But you're going to find that you're going to have perhaps you're going to start thinking about your thought process a little bit more. You might have some sort of, it depends on how it's affecting your personal chart, but the archetypal themes will be at play for anybody who's having a Mercury transit, right? How it plays out for you is unique and individual based on your chart and based on how you respond to what life is offering you.
Can we go back to that example of your teacher and the depression that he was going through?
Sure.
Mm-hmm. So how could knowledge of astrology assist him during that time or help him understand?
Right. So, and I'll speak from my own personal example as well. When we are experiencing a difficult moment and we see that there's a lifespan to it, so our transits last for certain periods of time, I think one, just knowing this is not the permanent state of my life. This is not going to be, like a lot of people when they're in difficult moments, it's very easy to have cataclysmic thinking. So for example, if you're having, I had a housing crisis last year, and one of the side effects to this crisis was that I was not sleeping well, both from stress and also from being in new environments constantly. I couldn't, like my body simply could not settle into an environment and feel safe enough and grounded enough to get adequate sleep. And then I was also in environments where I was being woken up frequently by neighbors and external stimuli, right? And so when you're not sleeping very well, you're not functioning very well. And for me, the side effect of the side effect was that I was very emotional all the time because I wasn't sleeping well. And I knew, as an astrologer, I could look at my chart and say there is a lifespan to this. I know that between this time and this time there will be a shift, and that shift is imminent, and I just need to hold on and make it through these few months. Whereas somebody without that knowledge might go into a state of really a negative self-talk. Everybody's different, right? There's some people who are the eternal optimist, but usually a person going through a crisis has a tendency to sink into a certain level of negative self-talk, and especially when the difficult moment is affecting the body in some way and they're not able to rest adequately. So knowing that the astrology is indicating both the challenge that you're experiencing and also the lifespan of that challenge is extremely helpful.
Mm-hmm. So knowing that information, it's sort of to be expected because of, I guess, looking at your chart.
Yeah,
it
frees you also of the not self-responsibility. We always have responsibility in how we navigate life. But for me personally, again, going back to myself because it's an easy example, I have a tendency, for example, to blame myself for anything that goes wrong. It's like I feel like I've done something wrong and I think a lot of us, especially as women, do this, especially in this new agey world we live in where everybody talks about manifesting, right? So it's like if you haven't manifested something perfect for your life, you've done something wrong or you're not doing something well enough. And that I don't believe that to be true at all. And so especially when I can see the astrology, it's like, no, my belief system is that our souls are evolving, and you evolve through difficult and strenuous moments. When life is happy and tra-la-la all the time, there's no stimulus for growth. And so the challenges are really useful in that way, and they prevent us from going into cataclysmic thinking. It's like, okay, how can I work with these energies to learn from them and improve myself and my life and how I interact with those around me even. Mm-hmm. And I'll say on the flip side of that, if you're having a positive transit, by positive I mean something that is, you're experiencing more abundance in your life or more joy or happiness, things are easy and bountiful in life. It's nice to know too that you better make hay while the sun shines, right? Like this is a very benevolent energy that's being offered to you, and you can harness that energy as well. It's not a time for, like sitting in the sun like a cat and just letting it go to waste. I mean, you can do that too, of course, but if you're having, let's say, a creative streak, it's like, well, you better sit down and make music during that time, or sit down at your table and start writing that story. That's not all that influx of energy or inspiration is not going to last for the remainder of your life, right? So it comes and goes. These energies are always waxing and waning, and so how do we take advantage of them when they're present?
I'm really glad that you said that, because I think a lot of people can relate to that idea that sometimes you feel really active and really creative, and then other times you might feel like really stuck or like you're up against a wall. And let's say you're a writer, and sometimes writers have writer's block, and sometimes the words just kind of flow. Or if you're in any activity or any hobby that you have, there might be times when you just feel like really inspired and really motivated and really creative, and then other times when you're not, and that could have to do with what's going on in your chart at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true. I had a client who's also a personal friend who came to me last year when the planet Mars was retrograde, and Mars goes retrograde, I think, every 2 or 2.5 years for about 3 months at a time. And when Mars is the warrior god and represents our ability to take action and to initiate. It's where we derive our energy. It's like life force. It's Manipura energy, right? It's our life force. And when Mars is retrograde, there is a marked decrease in our energy levels. You kind of just don't want to do anything. And not only do you not want to do anything, but you also, the energy of stagnation is so strong that when you do try to assert yourself, you're usually thwarted in some way. And so she came to me at a time when she was starting a new business, and her partner was really encouraging her to get going. Like, why are you delaying? But she didn't, because Mars was retrograde and it was affecting her chart stronger than even the average person's. She was like, what's going on? Like, I know that I want to do this, but I don't want to do this right now. And I said to her, girl, you just need to sit back for 3 months. Like, now is the time to think about it and to formulate your action plan. It is not the time to take action. And so knowing this, even because we, again, in our Western world where we're constantly told, our culture tells us constantly that you have to act, you have to take action, you have to work hard. If you don't have something that you want, it's because you're not doing it right. And the more energy you exert, the more rewards you will reap, right? But if the cosmic forces, the energy is encouraging you to do something different and you're going against that flow, then being out of harmony, right, is not going to behoove you. So if you know, actually, there's a reason that I feel down right now and it's okay. Like, I basically gave my client permission to not overextend her very limited energetic resources, which is, so she had, her partner telling her, take action, and her gut was saying, no, I don't want to do that, but her mind was saying, but I probably should, and that's the message she was getting from her partner. And she sat down with me and I was like, absolutely not. You will derive no benefit from this. You need to wait and formulate during this time, which is equally beneficial, right? Like, it's not that you sit around and do nothing, it's that you do what the energy is asking you to do. That's where astrology can be really useful.
Yeah, I can totally see that. And that kind of reminds me of just how nature works. Like, in the winter time, it's a time where, the sun's not out as long, the weather's colder. So things kind of go into hibernation, like flowers aren't blooming, fruits aren't usually growing. And then in the springtime, when the sun comes out and it gets a little warmer, then things start to bloom, things start to get a little bit more active. But if a flower tried to bloom in the winter time and was trying to fight against nature and the weather, it would have a really hard time.
Yeah, not only would it have a hard time, it's most likely going to die.
Right.
So that's exactly right. That's a really good, it's not even a metaphor. It's just truth. That's what we see from nature. It's truth in nature that we can observe. And it's a great parallel that you're making.
Okay. Yeah. And even like bears, they hibernate into winter time. And if they didn't, they would probably not survive.
Right.
Because they kept trying to like hunt and do stuff.
Right.
So how can we as humans live a little bit more in flow with nature and with the planets and yeah, okay. All right, I can see this. It's coming together. Yeah, I love this. This has been really eye-opening for me.
Great.
What's the difference between astrology and astronomy?
Yeah, so astrology is the study of how the planets influence us, as we discussed at the very beginning. And astronomy is really the scientific study of the planets. And so in earlier times, you could not be an astrologer without being an astronomer. And almost all astronomers were also astrologers because you were observing these patterns of the heavens and also not just observing their physical movement through the sky, but how it was affecting us. And it was very commonplace for, and it's so funny because most people because astrology is still so stigmatized, we don't allow for, a lot of people don't know, or even, they can't even actually acknowledge to themselves that our most well-respected mathematicians and astronomers were also astrologers. And we have factual proof for this. I'm not the right astrologer to talk to you about the history of astrology, but there is an astrologer, his name is Gemini Brett. Mm-hmm. And he has several fantastic YouTube videos about the science and the astronomy and astrology overlaps, and how Kepler, and I think I mentioned some of these, Galileo, etc., were all very effective astrologers in their own right. We know this factually. So he's a great person to Google, Gemini Brett, if you want to know more about that. But you must have a basic understanding of astronomy to be an effective astrologer. And I don't think you need to know anything about astrology to be an effective astronomer, but it sure does make you a better astronomer, because and Gemini Brett goes into this a lot. There's so many misunderstandings about astrology that are touted by the astronomical community in an attempt to further discredit astrology. And so this is where if we can, astrologers and astronomers, the more we know about each other and the more we can study each other's disciplines, the better off both disciplines will be. Truly, it's like there, and I think we will see that astrology has only really started to be more accepted in mainstream culture in the past, less than 100 years. It was really, there's an astrologer, she's passed away, but her name is Linda Goodman. And a lot of people know her because she wrote this huge book called Sun Sign Astrology, or Love Signs. She wrote a book called Sun Sign Astrology, but also Love Signs. And she was an exquisite astrologer, and she really brought astrological knowledge to the mainstream in America. And so I really believe it was Linda Goodman who kind of opened the door for our culture. Like, she opened the door to our psyche in terms of folks being able to ingest this information without just rejecting it because of our long-standing and systematic persecution and denial of astrology.
Okay. There was one more question. What was it that I had? All right, it's not coming to me right now. So if somebody were to sit down, like to go to you or to an astrologer, what would that look like? What would a session look like?
So, of course, I can speak for myself in terms of what a consultation looks like. All astrologers have their own methodology. For a first-time consultation, I sit with my clients for 90 minutes. I find that any less time isn't adequate enough to go deeply into their chart. And I usually start by explaining their big three, their sun, their moon, and their ascendant, and how that really the sign in which their big three fall in are like the building blocks, the foundations of their life. And then from there, I look at major aspects in their chart. So anything that is really stands out or is particularly potent energy for how their life is affected. So we see these archetypal themes, like you'll hear astrologers say, oh, that person's very Saturnian, or that's a mercurial person. And what that means is that that planet is dominant in a person's chart. And sometimes that isn't the case. Sometimes a person won't have a dominant planet that is very obvious. And other times it's like, whoa, there's a lot going on right here. We're going to talk about that. And then I also frequently will get into transits, which again is what's happening in the heavens currently and how is that affecting you personally. And the transits are extremely important because they're reflecting the cycles of life. And as I said before, sometimes you're up, sometimes you're down, the wheel is always turning and spinning. And so that's where transits are very important because they can help you navigate certain periods of life. And I find that my clients usually have a very specific question or topic that has instigated their inquiry. And that's how we spend a lot of time. So my last client had a lot of questions about her career, and it was very obvious in her chart that career was at the top of her mind, and it was activated in her chart. The archetypes for career were very active in her chart, and it wasn't at all surprising that she came to me seeking counsel on that. You find that it's so funny because astrologers were reflecting back what's happening. And so I often say, I'm not going to tell you anything that you don't already know. What I'm going to do is give you permission to better understand yourself and to say, for example, you're like this for a reason. You should be this way. You don't need to change yourself. This is very specific for your soul's incarnation and evolution. Like, you're doing you. Continue. Right? So a lot of people need that.
Okay. And then if, like, knowing that information, how can people best use that information to, I guess, make better decisions or guide the direction of their life?
Yeah, that's a great question, Julie. And I think everybody will put the information to use as they see fit in their lives. Some people are at a position in life, and I tend to think that most people who seek astrological consulting are in a position to make a shift in their life, that they're open to receiving this knowledge and using it to benefit themselves in some way. But like with everything, when you're given knowledge, you can pursue it actively, or you can put it on the bedside table and not look at it again for a few months. And I think it really depends on what type of information you're being given, because certain transits that a person is experiencing are heavier than others. And often that information really needs to penetrate the psyche and kind of integrate into a person's overall body, mind, spirit before, everybody is different and at different stages of their spiritual path. And so for some people, they're going to actually need to do more. Like one client I was like, my suggestion is to you is that the best way to navigate this existing time is to go get a journal and start writing every single day as your form of meditation, because, well, there were reasons why, right? But that was a very tangible action that I encouraged her to take. Whereas other folks, they need to be still and quiet and be in meditation every day. And other people, right, it looks different for everybody. But I think that astrology absolutely is poignant in that it does give you the tools for navigating life. If you're in a positive, if you're in an upswing or downswing, regardless, there's information there that can help you navigate.
Okay, that makes sense. So I spoke with an astrologer yesterday, and so I was talking about how I have a lot of ideas and things that I want to bring to fruition, and taking action on those things has always been my challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And he was looking at my chart, and he was like, the biggest thing for you to know and to remember is that you're in your chart, looking at your chart, you're here to be of service. And so asking yourself the simple question, how can I be of service, will help you to take the action you need to take, instead of feeling stuck because you feel insecure, or because you're in your head about what might happen or what the outcome might be. But if you switch that conversation to just, how can I be of service, then that already made me feel better, and just letting that guide me instead of the voices in my head about the insecurities that I have be the main guide,
Right.
I felt like that was just really, really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a friend who's an Aries, and the Aries archetype is to initiate. And so folks who have a lot of Aries energy, not just their sun sign, but in their chart generally, will frequently start projects. That's their purpose. Their purpose is to explore and to get to know themselves more by starting things, to see like, ooh, this looks interesting. I'm going to go over there and do that thing. Well, then they start doing it and they realize, it was only interesting to begin the project. Now I know a little bit more about it. I'm not interested anymore. I'm going to dump it and go do something else. And in our society, we frequently consider people who start things without finishing them. We frown upon that, or we kind of, turn our nose like, oh yeah, they always have a new idea, but do they follow through? Well, if you're an Aries person, you're not meant to follow through. If you were following through, you would be acting outside of the archetypal energy. You would be acting outside of what is actually best for your soul's evolutionary growth, which is to understand you better by engaging in as many activities as you possibly can, which necessitates not following through all of the time, because if you were constantly following through, you wouldn't be engaging in a multitude of experiences, right? So when you tell somebody who's an Aries, you're doing exactly what you should be doing by ceasing an activity as soon as you grow bored. It's like, oh my God, really? Like I'm not, gives them permission to be who they are.
I love that.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I don't need to keep pressuring myself. That's awesome.
Right. Now, I wouldn't advise that for somebody who's a Capricorn. If somebody who came to me with a lot of Capricorn energy was not following through, they're actually like, Capricorn is the sign of responsibility. So why are you not following through? There's a block to some sort of like your emotional maturation is blocked in some way that you're finding the need to constantly dump a project, right? I would have a completely different consultation with that person.
Okay. I'm going to ask you a personal question because
Sure.
I was born on May 21st, so I'm on the cusp of Gemini and Taurus.
Mm-hmm.
How does that fall into this whole starting and stopping and following through your project?
Yeah, it's a great question, the cusp, and it's not just a personal question. There's so many people born on the cusp, and the cusp is simply a word to denote that the sun changed signs on that day, which means that you absolutely need your time of birth to determine in what sign your sun is in. And aside from that, there's virtually no significance to the cusp in terms of your sun sign. So a lot of people will say, oh, well, I'm really Taurean and also Gemini. No, you're not. The sun is only in one sign at a time. Mm-hmm. And the personal planets, which are Mercury, Venus, and Mars, they do move very quickly with the sun. And so it is possible that the personal planets will be in a sign that is close to the sun's sign, meaning that you'll have more Taurus or Gemini energy, but the sun's only in one sign at a time. And in fact, if you're born with the sun at the very last degrees of a sign or the very first degrees of a sign, it emphasizes the energy of that sign. So folks who are born on the cusp are actually more of a Taurus or more of a Gemini than the average person. I wouldn't say more of, but that energy is being expressed in a very potent way. So that's this is again where pop culture astrology is really misleading unintentionally, because these definitions are really so important. So I don't know, like in the Vedic astrology, the reading that you received yesterday, the Indian astrology, you are absolutely a Taurus in Vedic astrology. But in Western astrology, evolutionary astrology, I would have to see your birth time to know. And I can tell you that it is likely that you're a Gemini just from talking to you, because you're doing a podcast. And the archetype of Gemini is to talk as much as possible, to communicate as frequently as possible, to disseminate information, right? That's what the Gemini function is. So I'd be inclined to guess that way. But of course, with the astrology, when an astrologer guesses a person's sun sign, what they're actually usually guessing is their ascendant, because your ascendant is what is the energy that you're presenting to the world. Our sun sign acts differently. So this is where astrology is just vastly, infinitely complex. And to say that the sun sign is, like you can tell so much about a person by their sun sign, you can. It doesn't mean that you're going to say everything, right? Like we discussed with reading your horoscopes in the magazines.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm just going to have to schedule a consultation with you so I can...
Please do.
Because I have so many questions. And I won't do it on the podcast.
But I mean, that question that you just asked me, you think it was personal to you, but a lot of your viewers or listeners are going to say, I was born on a cusp too. And that doesn't really mean anything. It just means I need to know my birth time.
Well, also, because I also I'm very curious, so I dabble in a lot of different topics, and so I start a lot of things. Yes. And I'll take a lot of classes, and then I won't dive any deeper after that one's done, right. And I'll kind of want to do something else.
That's also the Gemini archetype, because Gemini is the archetype of the student. So Geminis tend to know a little bit about a lot of things, but they don't necessarily dive deeply. So they're the folks who have 4 books on the nightstand, none of which are completed, or, they can quote from any discipline, but they couldn't actually teach a class on it. But this is where that conversation, it's a highly mental energy. So Mercury is the planet that rules the sign of Gemini, and the function of Mercury, there's actually a survival element to this archetype, and it is that through the accumulation of knowledge, the person with a lot of Mercurial or Gemini energy feels safer. They're better able to navigate life by knowing more. So a lot of these individuals will be the consummate student because it makes them feel safe, actually. And this is particularly true if you have a Gemini moon, because knowledge is where you derive your sense of safety. And so in that way, right, we can't navigate life without knowledge. So if you don't put your seatbelt on, you're probably going to be pulled over by a cop. Or if you don't have a college degree, it may be more difficult for you to find a job that pays as much as you would like to make to purchase the house that you want, right? So knowledge is power, and knowledge is also a form of safety. So for folks who have a lot of Gemini energy, or if Mercury is very prominent in a person's chart, they will be dabbling with information. They're very highly stimulated individuals. They're very curious, very, very mental. And so their function is to accumulate as much knowledge as possible and to disseminate it back. So these individuals are usually telling other people about what they have learned. They find that just a very, very engaging activity to talk about all of these things.
Okay, just hearing you say that makes me feel so much better about myself. Because, oh my gosh, Eileen, I used to feel, and I've come to peace with this, but I used to feel like I was so scattered because I always wanted to like study something new. I always wanted to like take a new class. And then I would feel kind of guilty that that I wouldn't always like dive deeper or go, take multiple classes in the same subject. It's kind of like I just wanted to learn about these different things and then go to something else. So it's really good to know that like that's normal for me.
It is. And this is again, I'm glad that you're having the personal experience with what I'm talking about, because this is the value of astrology. Like when I say, I'm not telling you something you don't already know. You already know this about yourself, but I'm saying it in a way that, like you said, it brings you some level of peace. Oh, this is who I am. This is what I'm meant to be doing. There's not actually something wrong with me that I want to dabble in in an ever expanding foray of disciplines, right? Like that's your function. That's what you should be doing. And that is the very nature of Gemini Mercurial energy, is to know a little bit about everything. And you'll find, especially with the study of astrology, that disciplines that capture or hold your attention are probably going to be those that are more complex, because Gemini has a very insatiable curiosity. And so as soon as things become like redundant or a little bit boring, right, which is very strongly earth energy, like the earth signs really like stability and consistency. The Gemini is like, oh my God, this is the most boring thing in the world. Can we change it up, please? So you are likely to find that a discipline that is ever changing or has a lot of variety actually can hold your attention. And if not, that's fine too. That's just the Gemini way.
And it's also, so I'm really feeling the value here, because it's like knowing this and knowing that this is typical for my sign just makes me feel like, instead of feeling bad about wanting to study all these different things, it makes me want to do it more, knowing that this is the natural for me. And it's okay to be the way I am.
Right. Absolutely. And a lot of Gemini folks, they talk so much. Oh my God, they're all the chatty Cathys. And they're talking because that's how you process. You're processing through communication. It's the communication, like the mental, verbal. So for a lot of the Mercurial Gemini folks in the world, it is through the talking that the understanding comes. Often you can't even understand your thoughts until they're articulated through writing or by speaking. And then it's the epiphany moment. It's like, well, geez, why didn't I just articulate this to begin with? So the talking is actually, and this is where if you're interacting with a Gemini person. So I teach an archetypes class every month. And this is why I teach it, is for folks to, not so that they're learning astrology, it's so that you're learning the archetypes and what the archetypes look like. So that, for example, if you're talking to somebody who talks endlessly, you can say, oh, I actually know that this person must have a strong Mercury or Gemini in their chart. They're talking constantly and they actually need to talk to process their thoughts. They can't actually understand what they're thinking without articulating it out loud. And I have more tolerance for their talking because I understand that it really is how they function through life. It doesn't mean it's not annoying or that it can't be imbalanced. Of course, there's imbalance in all of these things, but it's so you understand, like, oh, right, they're supposed to be doing that. That's in their nature. It's totally fine.
Oh, yeah, this is all very reassuring because I do, I do think that I process when I'm talking out loud.
Yeah, of course you do. That's what Gemini does. It is the mental faculties. So it's the rational mind, and it's taking information from the external environment, processing it mentally, and then spitting it back out so that it understands, communicating it to process and understand. And that's how you feel safe. So, for example, I once had a boss who was a psychologist, and I have a Gemini moon, by the way, which is why I can speak to this so articulately. But I was having nightmares about my cat dying in an earthquake. I lived in San Francisco. We were starting to have a lot of earthquakes. I started having nightmares, and the nightmares were always about my cat and not being able to care for my cat. And so my boss said to me, well, as a psychologist, what can you do to empower yourself so that you feel like your cat's not going to die if there's an earthquake, that you're taking care of your cat? And I was like, oh, of course. And I got online and I researched, what do people do with their animals in natural disasters? And I equipped myself with knowledge. I took action based on the knowledge that I found. And my nightmares stopped. Literally, they stopped. I never had another one. And it was the knowledge that helped me feel safe, and as though I was able to, do something proactive for myself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Yeah, this has been great. Yeah. I remember one time somebody said to me, like, they were actually talking about somebody else, and they were like, doesn't that person think before they speak? And I remember thinking to myself, like, do I think before I speak? I think I just speak out loud and then I figure out when I'm talking.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it's Gemini. It's very Gemini.
Okay. This is great, Eileen. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Blown. I feel so good.
Wonderful.
So, Eileen, for people who want to have a consultation with you or just learn about the workshops and the classes that you offer, how can people find you?
Yeah, right now the best way is social, and primarily Facebook. I am on Instagram, but I'm just not as active on Instagram as Facebook. And my handle on both of those platforms is @Mello Astrologer, and I'm Portuguese, so my last name is Mello, and Mello is spelled M like Mary, ELLO. So it's Mello Astrologer. And you can also call me if you want a consultation. My phone number is 510-393-8941. And that information is also on social. So if you just search for me on Facebook, Eileen Mello, it's Eileen with an E, you'll find me. And all my classes are listed that way. And I would happily get a phone call from any of your listeners.
Okay, awesome. So you do personal consultations, and then you have an archetype class every week or every month?
Once a month, and I teach it on whatever sign the sun is in. So right now we're in Cancer, so my next class is on the moon and on Cancer.
Awesome. And then do you have, where are you located?
I'm in Nevada City, California, which is in the Sierra Nevada foothills. And I do consultations in person as well as on the phone or through Zoom or Skype, whichever the client prefers.
Okay. Awesome. Is there anything that you want to share about astrology before we finish up today?
Yeah, I really would encourage if any of your listeners have an inkling or an impulse to learn more, to give me a call, not only for consultations, but in terms of learning more and actually studying the discipline. It's of course not for everyone. It's like anything that you study, you're either going to have an impulse to do it or not, but it is a wisdom that seems to be emerging into the mainstream more and more. And obviously the collective is at a point when we are ready to receive this information. Again, there were hundreds of years where we were not receptive to it for whatever reason, but I think that we've been in the age of reason now for several hundred years, and we've seen where that's gotten us. We've completely ravaged the earth, and our values are so out of alignment with living in harmony with each other and the planet. And I think that astrology is really going to be a powerful tool for helping folks navigate through life in a very difficult moment in time. So it's not only useful for our soul, our spiritual evolutionary journey, but also just on a mundane day-to-day life path journey. So yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was great fun to chat with you.
You too. It was super helpful, super informative, and I'll have all of your information in the show notes.
Great.
And thank you so much for joining us and just sharing all of your knowledge and your wisdom.
Thank you. I hope to chat with you again soon.
Me too.
Boop, 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 boo. I hope you've enjoyed this interview with Eileen Mello. If you're interested in learning more about astrology or would like to work with Eileen, she's generously offering $25 off for first-time clients. Just mention the code Rainbows Are Circles to receive the discount. I highly recommend working with Eileen. After recording this episode, I signed up myself for a 90-minute consultation, and I received so many more insights and valuable tools to help me navigate certain challenges that I was facing in my life. So if you're looking for a little bit of guidance or just to learn more about astrology and your chart, definitely reach out to her. Thanks so much for tuning in to this week's show. If you'd like to subscribe to the podcast so you can get these episodes downloaded as soon as they're available, please hit the subscribe button. You can also leave a rating and review for the podcast, which helps to grow the show and reach even more listeners. An additional way you can support Rainbows Are Circles is by donating $1 a month to the podcast. Every single dollar counts and ensures that Rainbows Are Circles stays alive and kicking. Just visit my Patreon page at patreon.com/rainbowsarecircles. As a patron, you'll have access to exclusive content at least once a month. For this month, I'll be creating a guided relaxation audio recording to help you unwind at the end of a long day and promote restful sleep. If you'd like to learn more about the show, please check out my website, rainbowsarecircles.com, or you can find me on Facebook and Instagram under the name Rainbows Are Circles. I truly appreciate all of your support, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Until then, have a magical day. Bam, ba, bam, bam, ba, bam, 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 ba, bam, bam, ba, bam, bam. Wow, 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 wow. Rainbows are circles.